don't read me the story, Greg. Tell me what you were going through when you wrote it. And so I'll take you through the process that I've gone through trying to answer that question. And in the process, I'll tell you about my granddad. I called him Pop Pop, so if I just slip, you'll know who I'm talking about. So the story that I wrote was about a guy named Joe Campos. And I believe that Joe Campos was the first American killed in the Korean War, even though history credits somebody else. And I got the tip from an email. As journalists, we get emails all the time. And this email was amazing. It mentioned Raytheon, it mentioned the Baseball Hall of Fame, it mentioned Area 51, the Lindbergh Bay. Not quite, but pretty close. But there was this nugget that said that this guy, Joe Campos, would have died roughly 2 weeks, roughly 10 days before the first credited American to have been killed in the Korean War. And I thought to myself, yo, if that's true, that's a story. But again, I'm a sports writer, so what am I going to do with this thing? I'm a weird sports writer. I did not spend my entire career writing sports. I've been an editor. I've edited news. I've done national news. I've done international news. I've done politics, I've done state government. I've also been in the field as a reporter. Whereas the overwhelming majority of my peers have only done sports. To the point that when I got the job, there were a lot of questions. Who is this guy? Where did he come from? And in your mind, you're thinking, yo, no, I can do this. But all of those doubts, like they creep in and they sit there. And it gets you when you're not expecting it. But then this email comes. And again, I know that if this nugget is true, then I got something. And so maybe I gravitated toward the story because I just wanted to prove to each and every last one. You probably said it. You probably said I didn't deserve my job. I wanted to prove that I was who I said I was, that I had the skills that I said that I had, that I'd earned my spot. But then I also thought about my granddad who had been in the Korean War. And I thought about my granddad's sacrifice for my family. I grew up in a tough town, and all of the stories that you hear about the town that I grew up in, none of that stuff applied to me because of the sacrifice that my granddad made when he was in the Army. He used to eat this stuff, they called it SOS, which stands for you know what, on a shingle. John, you're right, that worked. Basically, it was a can of food. This can had eggs and mystery meat, God only knows what, and this really stale piece of bread. And nobody would eat it, but my granddad, he'd kind of go around and he'd get the cans of SOS from anybody who didn't want to eat it. And one of his jobs was to drive his commanding officer from here on the base to way over there on the base. And what he would do is he would take his cans and put it on the engine so that it'd get hot. It didn't taste any better, but at least it was warm. And so consequently, he had a sharper mind than his peers who were hungry. He had a more fit body than his peers who were hungry. And consequently, he ended up getting himself promoted and promoted and promoted. And every time he got promoted, he got a little bit safer because he got a little bit further away from that front line. Everybody was shooting. And his retirement package got better and his benefits got better and he lived a long, healthy life. Died about 5 years ago. I still miss him. So all of that's rattling around in the back of my mind while I'm trying to figure out whether this tip is true. So I'm told that there's this tiny little museum in a tiny little town in eastern Arizona, Globe, Miami area. And sure enough, I called the museum director, and he takes a photo of the exhibit, and sure enough, the date's on there. And so I go running back to my editor like, yo, I've got it. Like, this is the story. So then I sit down with my editor and another editor, and I don't have anything, right? Like, they start asking me questions, and I'm completely unprepared for the questions they ask me, which was an odd feeling. So one of the ways that I've learned how to deal with doubt is to just be like confident, like I know what I'm doing and I just trust it. Regardless of whether I actually believe that, I just do it. And I think of that analogy about the duck with his feet under the water and it looks smooth on top, but it's like crazy underneath. That's how it feels. So needless to say, I completely botched this first pitch with my editors in the office. So now I gotta take extra steps to prove that this story's true so that I can write this story. Because if history has credited a white guy from West Virginia as being the first American killed in the Korean War, when everybody knows that he couldn't even have been the first guy to have died that day, it's wrong. And if there's a guy named Joe Campos in eastern Arizona who gave his life in service to this country, if he was first, then we ought to know that. That's a problem if we don't know it, and it's true. We've got to say that. So I'm in Chase Field, and I'm looking for the flag lady. There's this lady who waves flags in Chase Field. You guys know Flag Lady? She's awesome. She was missing all last year. She was missing. She had gotten hurt, like she fell and hurt her leg. I found Flag Lady, and I was actually spinning flags with Flag Lady. But like right before I was supposed to meet her, my phone rang, and it was the tip that I needed to confirm this story. So now I'm on the phone, and I'm looking for Flag Lady, and it's in Chase Field, and here comes my photographer, and there's a million things going on, but I gotta tell this story. And again, I'm trying to figure out, why do I have to tell this story? And I'm taken back to my granddad. I could do like no wrong for this guy. I would like mow the lawn. He'd be like, man, that's the greatest lawn. Give me like 20 bucks here. And this is back when 20 bucks meant something, right? Like me and my buddies, we would go and we would like buy hamburgers and then spend the rest of it on quarters for Street Fighter. And he would always tell me how proud of me that he was. I'm proud of him. But I hadn't done anything to earn that. I just existed, and that was enough. Anyway, I go back to my editors, and I explain what I've got, and I'm like super organized. I got like spreadsheets and charts and like little clickers. I don't have all that, but I got my stuff together. And they say, okay, you can do this so long as it doesn't take, your other duties. It doesn't take you away from your other duties. That's cool. I gotta write 3 columns a week, and sometimes I write, little quick hits, and sometimes I write a lot, sometimes I don't write so much. That's okay, it's a fun job, it's sports, right? It's sports. But I'm up in the middle of the night, and I'm like going through these newspaper websites, their archives, and I'm looking at these magazine archives, and I'm trying to make sure that I've got the emails right, and I'm trying to make sure I got my time zone straight so I can call this source over here and that source over there. And in my mind, I keep going back to Tucson, Arizona, the very first time I met with Jovita and Jenny Campos. Jovita is Joe Campos' widow. Jenny is Joe Campos' daughter. They've got a beautiful home in Tucson. And on Memorial Day, they told me the whole story. They opened up their photo albums. They showed me their records. They told me everything I'd want to know about this story and more. And consequently, I was able to say that although history credits Kenny Shadrick with being the first American killed in the Korean War, we know that about 10 days earlier, there had been a whole bunch of airplanes that flew out, reconnaissance mission, and they were going to bomb a rail yard. And 3 planes crashed on the way back. One of those 3 planes ditched into the Yellow Sea, and one of the 2 men killed in that crash was Joe Campos. And we can prove that, we can show that. The military knows it. In fact, there's even a little plaque in Korea where this happened. So why doesn't Life magazine acknowledge it? Why doesn't the Truman Museum acknowledge it? Why doesn't the Smithsonian acknowledge it? Why doesn't the state of Arizona acknowledge it? I don't know, but we wrote that story and it published. And the response that we got was overwhelmingly positive. Thank you so much for telling this story. I can't believe that this has been this overlooked for this long. This is something that everybody ought to know. Thank you so much for sharing it. Thank you so much for telling it. Thank you so much for telling it. And I keep coming back to why did I have to tell this story? Because you guys know, this wasn't my story to tell. I'm not from Arizona. I'm a black guy, I'm not Hispanic. This isn't my story, but then I thought, you know what? I'm also not a 7-foot-tall millionaire athlete, and I tell their stories all the time. It's so awkward to interview basketball players. You gotta stand back like this far, because And it also kind of cemented in my mind that although there might have been doubt among certain people about my qualifications, I am still the guy who was named one of the top 5 sports columnists in the nation at newspapers this size 6 months into the job. I told everybody Herman Edwards was going to be a good hire. I told everybody Steve Wilkes should have never switched the Arizona Cardinals defense. And I told the Phoenix Suns they should have drafted De'Aaron Fox and not Josh Jackson, even though Josh is from my hometown. And so, but why did I want to tell this story about Joe Campos? Because when I was sitting with Jenny and when I was sitting with Jovita, I felt like I could have been sitting with my aunt, my mother, my grandma. Their story was so similar to my story that it hurt. Joe experienced racism and prejudice in eastern Arizona that included not being able to swim in the community swimming pool, except for the day before they drained it and cleaned it so that white people could get back in the next day. Joe couldn't go to the school that was closest to his house because he had to go to the school that was designated for people with skin color and last names like his. Joe couldn't get the kind of job he wanted regardless of his qualifications because those jobs were sectioned off for other people and he had to take these jobs that were deemed okay for him. And I felt like that could have been my own grandparents telling me their story. And I said, everybody has to know that this man gave his life so that his wife and daughter could have a better life. And he did it, and it worked. And the whole world needs to know it, and I've got to be the one to tell it. And I got back to thinking about my granddad and how he always used to tell me how proud he was of me, regardless of whether I had done anything to earn that pride. When I wrote that story, I felt like maybe I'd earned it. Maybe Pop Pop would be proud.